I'm wearing the.
Okay. Well, I'll just announce it here. Well, we're going to start our event, and it's my pleasure to introduce Judd Bagley of overstock.com and T0.com. Judd is going to talk about the topic on which I don't have any knowledge about it, and I'm sure a lot of us would be the same boat. And the topic is digital shares and digital currency. And you probably heard about Bitcoin and things like that. So Judd is going to talk about it. I also want to make an announcement that this event is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube. And Brian is going to give directions to people how to access this event. So with that, I will introduce Judd.
Do you want to? Is it? I mean, is it working?
Is it?
Yes.
Hello?
Is it on mute? Top. Very top.
It is. Okay. Is that better? Okay, good. As Subhash told you, my name is Judd Bagley. I kind of have two roles. I'm the Director of Communications at Overstock.com, but I'm also, well, about a year and a half ago, Overstock.com decided to create a subsidiary, which we're calling T0, and I'll explain the significance behind that name in a minute. And my responsibility within T0 is as kind of chief evangelist. So I'm here to spread the good news about cryptocurrency and crypto technologies and ways that it can be very interesting and revolutionary ways that it can be applied. Let me start by getting a sense for the kind of technical, the crypto literacy of the group. Is there anybody that had not heard about Bitcoin before today, or before this learning about this event? Okay. Does anybody own Bitcoin, or have you ever owned Bitcoin? One. Okay. Two. Three. Good. Well, that's actually slightly overrepresentative of the general population, which is about between 2 and 5% of people in America have ever owned or dabbled in cryptocurrency. So looks like we have a pretty representative crowd. So I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it as non-technical as I can, and I'm going to be asking questions of you as we go along. So we'll kind of keep this as a conversation. But if you have kind of like large questions that are not directly on the present topic, save those to the end, because there's going to be time to talk about them. And then if you want to continue the conversation with me, LinkedIn's probably the best way to do it. So please send me a connection request, or Twitter, where I'm at Writer Judd. So the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of trade. And we as Homo sapiens have pretty much existed in this same form for about 100,000 years. And during 99.99999% of that time, if you wanted to trade something with another person, it was somebody that you had a relationship with. So let's talk about kind of a theoretical, two people who are neighbors. They live just a few homes from each other. And one has a baseball mitt and one has some money, and they want to engage in trade, and it's easy. One walks over to the home of the other and they make the exchange right there. And the reason why they're able to do that so fluidly and with so little friction is because of trust. They know each other, they understand each other's reputation, they know that people around them are going to gossip, and so if one of them defrauds the other, it's going to be damaging to them. So that's how trade has worked through the vast majority of human history. Now, trade in very recent history is very different, because we're operating on a much larger scale. So generally speaking, if you are engaging in trade with another person or another entity, whether you are, purchasing something that was made, you go to the store to buy something, it was almost certainly not made within 5 miles of you. Okay, it was made somewhere else, and you almost certainly do not know the person who made it. Consequently, there is no trust. There are no of those kind of reputation effects, and what that means is there are misaligned incentives. Meaning, if I'm sending you money and you're sending me a thing, I'd much rather just get the thing and keep my money, and you'd much rather just get the money and keep the thing. These kind of misaligned incentives need to be overcome and accommodated for and accounted for in some way. And the way that we as humans have learned how to do that is through the invention of centralized institutions. And these are kind of monolithic, very central, impersonal institutions that act as proxy for the trust that is otherwise absent in interpersonal relationships when we're engaging in trade. So what are the pros of centralized institutions? Well, first, it's worth pointing out that every one of these centralized institutions operates around a ledger. So each one of them, whether it's a bank or it's Visa or whatever you can think of, they keep a ledger of accounts. And this ledger is super secret. I mean, they go to great lengths to keep this thing secure so that nobody has any idea like what activities happened in the thing, whose account balances read what, and certainly nobody can get in from outside and make changes to it. So these centralized ledgers are the thing which keep these centralized institutions working. So the pros of this kind of setup are these centralized institutions are very trustworthy. So whether I don't know you and you don't know me, we're engaging in trade, but we both trust Visa, so we use Visa to stand in the middle of this, of our transaction. And Visa's not just doing it because it wants to or it's trying to be altruistic. Visa takes a little money along the way and also takes a little bit of your time. So if you are, if you're a vendor, you give me the thing and I send you, and I engage in a transaction with Visa with you, you don't get that money right away. And when you do get the money, it's not for the full amount, or you have to pay a little more in terms of transaction fees. So there's friction, there's money, and there's time that you spend. So the cons of this kind of setup are that generally there's a single point of failure. So it can, if you are a skilled hacker there and you want to exploit some weakness, there's one place you have to go, and once you're in, you can do whatever you want. So there's a single point of failure. That's a huge problem. Also, a lot of these institutions engage in fractional reserve. So if you're a bank and you have X number of dollars on deposit, you can go play with 90% of those as long as you keep 10% behind. But everybody knows in dire kind of economic times, that ends up being that has a potential of being like a game of musical chairs where, when everyone goes to reach for a chair, someone's going to find that they don't have a chair. There's also this big and a little more esoteric issue of what's called regulatory capture. When you have entities like the Federal Reserve, it's possible, and this was very prominently demonstrated about 2 years ago, when a woman who worked for the Federal Reserve of New York, I believe, recorded conversations that took place between regulators and Goldman Sachs, and found that the Federal Reserve, the regulators, were very, very deferential to Goldman. And this was in large part due to this phenomenon called regulatory capture, which is just part of human nature, which basically means that regulators will often become beholden to the entities they are regulating, because they very often depend on those entities for their long-term career prospects. So regulatory capture, it's very easy to capture a regulator when that regulator or that centralized institution is very compact. Also, what happens in these centralized institutions is completely opaque. Okay, by design, people on the outside are not allowed to see any more than what they have permission to see, which is their own account status. And finally, there's a lot of friction, which equates to fees and time, like we talked about. The time isn't just a problem insofar as there's money, a vendor, for example, might be losing in terms of interest that they could be collecting, but there's also counterparty risk. If you're not settling a trade in real time, the longer you go between the trade actually happening and settlement, that's an amount of time in which the counterparty can default. Okay, so there's increasing counterparty risk with increasing settlement time. So there have been a few attempts to create, with the invention of the internet, there have been a few attempts to create internet traded currencies. Okay, this has been done since pretty close from the beginning. I remember the first one I learned of in about 1996. It was called e-gold. There's also Flues, Beans, Linden Dollars, Facebook Credit, PayPal, Apple Pay, and the very unfortunately named ISIS, which had to change their name to Softcard. Now, what do all these things have in common? Well, several of them are gone. E-gold, Flues, and Beans are all gone. These others are making a go at it. But what do they all have in common? They all rely on the centralized institution. Okay, they are the centralized institution, and they maintain a very secret, complete ledger of accounts. And they have with them all the other risks that go along with dealing with the centralized institution. Okay. Who here's a fan of Milton Friedman? Yeah, if you weren't before, you're gonna be now. This guy is brilliant. And just to give you a sense of how brilliant, I want to play for you a clip that this is something he said in 1999, which is just shocking. I mean, my parents in 1999, they still don't understand the internet, and they're relatively young. Milton Friedman, in a fairly advanced age in 1999, already understood something really key. I'm going to play this for you now. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I realized there was a risk that there would be a technical problem and the clip wouldn't play, so I put. Oh, can you do it? Okay. Oh, it's saying QuickTime not available. Okay, sorry. So here's what he said, basically. He said, he talked about the future of the internet. And he said that inevitably there's going to be invented some form of electronic cash. He said the one thing that's missing but will soon be developed is a reliable e-cash, a method whereby on the internet you can transfer funds from A to B without A knowing B or B knowing A. The way in which I can take a $20 bill and hand it over to you, and there's no record of where it came from. And you may get that without knowing who I am. That kind of thing will develop on the internet. Okay. So, I mean, the guy was just, anyway, Milton Friedman, amazing. And so he had this sense already in his 80s. Toward, obviously he was done with his career and approaching the end of his life. So 10 years later, along came somebody called Satoshi Nakamoto. And he or she or they, nobody knows exactly, published a white paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. In this paper, Satoshi Nakamoto, again, which is a pseudonym, nobody knows exactly who it is, although I should point out, there have been a couple of decent attempts at figuring out. Newsweek magazine revealed in about this time in 2014, they figured it was this mathematician who lives in California, whose name happened to be Satoshi Nakamoto. That's almost certainly been disproved. And then I don't know how well you guys follow Bitcoin-related news in that, but last week, an Australian fellow named Craig Wright came out and tried to claim that he was Satoshi Nakamoto, and he actually endeavored to offer some kind of cryptographic evidence, which for about a day held up. But then by the next day, it was basically disproven, and he's now essentially kind of rescinded his claim. But anyway, so there have been a couple attempts to figure out exactly who Satoshi Nakamoto, well, there have been infinite attempts to figure out who it is. There were two instances where people generally thought they knew, but in both cases, they've not panned out. Anyway, so Satoshi Nakamoto published this white paper basically saying there is a way to use cryptography as a proxy for the trust that centralized institutions offer in the course of anonymous exchange in the context of misaligned incentives. So this white paper was published in 2009. A big group of software developers jumped on it and started working on it and came out with Bitcoin, which began trading in 2009. So what defines Bitcoin? They're basically Bitcoin has 4 really unique features. One is wallets and keys. So if you want to trade Bitcoin, you use a software to create, at no expense to you, a wallet, which is a big string of numbers and letters. And those are generated randomly. There's usually one wallet generated for every transaction that takes place. And so you would think that at some point we'd run out of wallet IDs, wallet addresses, but that's actually, there are more permutations of that many numbers and letters in upper and lowercase than there are atoms in our solar system. So we're probably safe. We're never gonna, for all intents and purposes, we're never gonna run out of wallet addresses. The other factor are keys. That is an example of a key. So you put, and I should point out, the time it would take to even with the most powerful supercomputer, to decrypt that key is currently 9 billion years longer than the universe has existed. So even if computing power advances by whole orders of magnitude, it will still take longer than the Earth has before the sun swells up as a red giant and destroys the planet. So for all intents and purposes, these are unhackable. So you have wallets and keys, and you can compare this setup to like a safe deposit box, a completely secure safe deposit box that has a glass door. So having the wallet number, you know where to find the corresponding safe deposit box, and you can look inside and see what's in there. But unless you have this key, you can't do anything with what's in there. So wallets and keys are the way that that Bitcoin is allocated, and anybody has access to the wallet number. Everybody can see a wallet address, but only you, as the wallet owner, have access to the key. And that's something that you keep completely secret, okay? And so then the combination of those two things form the basis of the encryption that happens here. So this is the kind of encryption that takes a lot of effort to create, but not much effort on the other side to prove that it was created accurately. And so the combination, again, of the wallet and the key makes for complete security. So if you have the wallet address and you also have the key, you have complete control over the contents of that wallet. Now, if you have somebody else's wallet number, wallet address, you can then send them Bitcoin. You don't need to have their key. All you need is their wallet address. You can send them Bitcoin. Okay. And the next defining factor of Bitcoin is this ledger. So this ledger, which it's currently about 60 gigabytes in size, exists on every computer on the Bitcoin network, which is currently about 100,000, and I'll address that more in a second. It exists separately on 100,000 computers, and it is updated constantly. It looks a little bit like this. So there's just this stream of data coming along, and it basically shows on the left you see a wallet address, on the middle you see a timestamp, and then on the right you see an amount of Bitcoin that was transferred from that wallet. Now, when you click on the wallet address, it would then show you the address to which that Bitcoin was sent. And so you can see the details of the transaction. But this is how it is. It's just a constantly running ledger that anybody who wants to can see the full thing. So you can see exactly how much Bitcoin is in every Bitcoin wallet address that exists. Now, you don't know who owns those, so you as the wallet address owner maintain anonymity, but anybody can look in. So remember, this is the safe deposit box with the glass door. So anybody can look in and see what's in there, but only if you have the key are you able to do anything with what's in there. Now, the other defining aspect of the Bitcoin ledger is it's called the blockchain, which is just another name for the Bitcoin ledger. And it kind of looks like this. So basically, there are groups of Bitcoin transactions that are bundled together, and you have all those different computers on the Bitcoin network that are competing to solve a kind of a complex math problem that will then verify the validity of every one of those transactions. And once the validity of every one of those transactions has been ascertained, those transactions are then added to the ledger in what's called a block. And because these blocks run sequentially, it's known as the blockchain. You've probably heard the term the blockchain before. That's where it gets its name. And what's interesting about it is that all these 100,000 computers, 100,000 plus computers, have to reach consensus on the blockchain. They all have to agree on what the correct representation of reality is. And if there is a ledger that comes along that disagrees, it's ignored. So you see, you can see, agree. Here's one that disagrees, where the disagrees, so it's ignored, and it proceeds. Everyone disagrees on that one, so it branches and moves on. So this is the blockchain. And what's interesting about the blockchain also is the fact that each one of these blocks carries with it an element of cryptography which builds upon the previous one. So using mathematics, you can anybody who wants to can demonstrate that this thing is valid. It is the same that this record can be traced all the way back to what they call the Genesis block, the very first one that was traded. So if I'm running a node on the Bitcoin network and I want to tinker with the blockchain, with the ledger, and I add, say, 1 million Bitcoin to my wallet address, if I'm the only place where that exists, my copy of the ledger is the only one where that exists. Everybody else is just going to ignore it and move on. Okay, so that's kind of a key aspect of Bitcoin as well. Finally, it's what defines Bitcoin is this Bitcoin network. So anybody can go and download the Bitcoin software. It's open source. Put it on your computer, let it run, and you can essentially turn your computer into one of those nodes, which is working to verify the validity of every Bitcoin transaction that takes place. And you then gain access to a complete copy of the Bitcoin ledger, the Bitcoin blockchain. So now let's talk about networks for a second. There are 3 different kinds of networks for the purposes of what we're talking about. The first is centralized. So what's an example of a centralized network you can think of? How about like Visa, for example? Every transaction ultimately goes through Visa, right? Okay, or any other bank. There are all kinds of centralized networks. So that's where ultimately every transaction, everything that happens has to pass through and be recorded in a single central location, which writes what happens to a single centralized ledger. The other kind of network is decentralized. Okay, this is like the internet. This is a bit more robust. There's not a single point of failure. There are single points where an outsider can do significant damage. But the internet was basically created by the Defense Department with the idea that if there were a nuclear war and whole sections of the network were destroyed, you could still route your way around it. So the internet is a decentralized network, which is, in terms of security and robustness, is a step above a centralized network. The final kind of network is a distributed network. Okay, so one thing that I should point out that kind of defines a decentralized network is there remains a hierarchy. So there are nodes and then subnodes and subnodes and subnodes. Each one of these kind of deferential to the one before. When you're talking about a decentralized network, there are no nodes. There's no hierarchy. Everybody's equal on this network. And this kind of network is extremely difficult. In fact, up to this point, impossible to attack, because you can go and if you were to hack a single computer running on the Bitcoin network, and you could from the outside make changes to its version of the ledger, again, it's just going to be ignored, and there are 100,000 other copies of it which are maintained and carry what the network considers to be truth. So decentralized distributed networks are the most robust and the safest and the least likely to succumb to an attack. This ledger, this network is distributed across 100,000 computers, probably more than that now. The entire network must agree, which imparts immutability, meaning, again, the record of truth cannot be changed, okay? The record of truth is immutable. These computers then work to ensure the validity of transactions, which makes sure there's no double spending, okay? Also make sure that one wallet has sufficient assets to send to another. If not, again, if I have a Bitcoin wallet with 3 Bitcoin and I try to send 4 to another address, it's just not gonna let me because that math doesn't work out. It shows I have insufficient resources. It's not gonna work. And the network of computers is constantly working to verify that. The network of computers is also constantly working to make sure that you are, oh, go ahead.
One quick question on this point you're making right there. So to avoid double spending, that ledger has to be maintained on those 100,000, and that takes time. So is there a period of time where if you do a transaction, you're locked down, or you can't do another one? How does that work?
So good question. It takes 10 minutes to process a block. So there's a new block that's processed every 10 minutes. If 2 conflicting transactions come up, in other words, if the same wallet sends a certain amount to one and a certain amount to another during those 10 minutes, the network will ignore the ones that came after. So that's so you can attempt to double spend all day, but nothing, but the ledger will not be altered to reflect anything that came after the first one. So that's how it does that. Very good question. And this double spending problem, incidentally, is the reason why every kind of effort at internet cache has needed to rely on a centralized ledger. Because again, if I have a file or something that says that I have $20, you know how things are. You can duplicate it. I can send it to you, and I can send it to you. And so this is one of the main kind of technological problems that the Bitcoin network has solved is figuring out how to deal with the double spending issue. These computers are also working to make sure that you have authorization to send that. In other words, they ensure that you use your private key to authorize the sending of Bitcoin from one address to another. And again, that's done through cryptography. The motive for all these computers operating, they're not just doing it out of altruism. The reason why there are 100,000 plus computers working, dedicating, people have to, it costs electricity and it costs time and it costs resources to do this. The reason why people do it, again, it's not just for fun or to be purely altruistic. It's because the computers that most effectively help maintain the network, the owners of those are paid in Bitcoin. So every block that is successfully processed, it's basically, it's a competition by all these 100,000 computers to see which one can solve this math problem first. Whichever one solves it first and make sure there's no double spending, make sure there's sufficient assets, make sure there's authorization, is rewarded with 25 Bitcoin, which when the Bitcoin network first started, that was pennies. Now it's actually a fair amount of money. And so consequently, and this action, by the way, is called mining. These computers are constantly working, competing to be the one that solves the math problem. They're rewarded with Bitcoin. That's how new Bitcoin is added to the ecosystem. And I think mining is a very apt comparison because it's in the same way that prospectors, you actually have to work for the gold that you're work for the gold that you're extracting, which in addition to the inherent value of the gold, the fact that you have expended effort in the money and time and resources to extract it, that itself gives the gold a certain amount of value. Okay, I think there was a hand over here. Go ahead.
You sort of answered my question already, but so what's the original amount and who determines how much Bitcoin is floating out there? Is it only through this mining process? Yeah, so the Bitcoin software has has written into it a system by which, again, every 10 minutes, 25 Bitcoin are dispersed. Now, I'm getting a little in the weeds here, but what's interesting is
the software also says that every certain amount of time that number of Bitcoin that are given to the miners will be halved. And so there's a big kind of controversy right now, or big source of concern right now in the Bitcoin community, because in the next week, that number goes from 25 to 12 and a half. Anyway, but the point is that's all in the software. And we will eventually run out of Bitcoin to add to the ecosystem in the year 2145, I believe it is. At that point, there will be 21 million Bitcoin that will have been added to the ecosystem, and then there will be no more. But the computers, the miners, will still be incentivized to continue mining, because what they will then do is they will charge transaction fees to the people who want to. So when you send Bitcoin, you'll have to attach to it a certain, a nominal amount of money, and that amount of money will go to the miners. Okay. So even though they won't be dispersed Bitcoin, there's still a way to make a living and be compensated by mining.
Are all of those new units that are generated dispersed via the miners? Is that they're the only ones that receive that allocation?
Exactly. And then if they want to convert that into dollars or whatever, then they have to. Then they're the ones who send it out into the Bitcoin ecosystem. So it starts with the miners. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, 21 million. And is it a function of time? You identify a specific, and then you identify a specific number. So is it a function of 21 million, or is it a function of time, or is there some relationship?
So one of the things that's interesting about and I'm going to get into this in just a minute, Bitcoin initially received real traction with libertarians. Libertarians like deflationary stores of value, like gold. Bitcoin was created to be deflationary. So there's no way to generate, you can't like Janet Yellen go and sign something which creates $7 billion. You can't do that. There's a set way it's going to do it. And all along, there are people who will do, for example, if I go and type in a Bitcoin address, I'm sending Bitcoin to you, but I mistype it, it gets destroyed. It gets sent out to nowhere, and it's just destroyed. There's no getting it back. So in essence, Bitcoin becomes a deflationary form of currency. So it was that kind of libertarian approach and seeking to make Bitcoin sort of a digital form of gold in that way. You can't just sign something and create more gold. There is a set amount of gold, which is, the total amount of gold out there increases by, I think, about 3% a year. And Bitcoin kind of ceases to emulate gold in that way. So very good question. Okay, so here's how trading with Bitcoin works then. We're back to this couple again. What happens is this ledger serves as the intermediary between these two people who don't know each other. It's cryptographically protected, public, and completely transparent. So the lady, she converts her dollars into these tokens. And then he also has some number of tokens. And the transaction simply happens like this. One token is erased from one and added to the other. It's that simple. So it's you don't have to have all these clearing banks and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just happens that simply. That amount is debited from your address and added to another address, just like that. Okay. So that's the essence of Bitcoin. Now, are there any more questions about Bitcoin? Go ahead.
How do I convert my dollars to Bitcoin?
Sorry?
How do I convert dollars to Bitcoin?
You would create an account with I use a firm called Coinbase, and you would send them your dollars. They would convert it into Bitcoin and put it in your wallet. And I'm not even sure how Coinbase makes money actually, because they don't charge transaction fees. So it's interesting there. But so that's essentially how you do it. You would find a payment processor, and you would send them dollars. They would make the conversion and then put it in your account. Out on the open market, right? And actually, that's how they're making money. They're arbitraging. There's a certain amount of the markets are not completely efficient, so people that are out in there can find opportunities to sell here and buy here.
What's the current conversion rate?
It's about $450 a Bitcoin. It's been as high as $1,200. That was kind of during a mania. It's been pretty stable in the mid 400 range for quite a while. So
what should determine that exchange?
it's just the market. It's what a buyer and seller are willing to agree on.
There's no economic fundamentals that will will determine that exchange rate?
Right, it's not pegged to anything. So, good
What's the
question.
friction in this kind of a thing? Earlier you thought like Visa, in case of Visa, I think it's about 1 or 2% of the fees goes to the Visa as a centralized unit. Is there something similar to the Bitcoin one? You said that they get about 1 Bitcoin for each mining.
They get 25.
25 Bitcoin.
Yeah, but it doesn't come from me. It just, the system adds 25 Bitcoin to their wallet, and then they're free to do with it as they wish.
What was the question? I couldn't hear it.
Oh, okay. So Subhash was asking, he was comparing the Visa. So Visa's, friction, Visa's fees are 1 or 2%. What's the equivalent of, so what am I, as someone who wants to send Bitcoin from one address to another, what am I paying? And the answer is currently nothing. It's the system adds 25 Bitcoin to the winning miner's address.
Once you reach that 21 million, that is.
Right, that changes, and then it's transaction fees. Right.
So every one of the 100,000 computers can see all of the wallets and how many units are in each wallet. Who controls the keys?
Oh, the individual, the wallet owner must control their key and keep it secret.
So, but is that Coinbase that issues the initial key? So if you give them
So yeah, I get my initial key from them. Yeah, and then I have to, but it's encrypted. So, well,
but
it's a little
Coinbase
complicated.
maintains the key on your behalf.
Right. Yeah. So that's one way. There are other ways of doing it, which are a little complex. You can, if you're running the Bitcoin software, you can. The challenge is converting your dollars to Bitcoin initially. But once you've done that, you don't need Coinbase. You can just run your own version of the Bitcoin software, and then you have complete control of your keys. You can create a new wallet, as many as you want, and then do whatever you want.
And the key is specific to the wallet, or is the key specific to the transaction?
It's to the wallet. So it's a combination. Again, it's a safe deposit box. So a single safe deposit box with a single key. That key can't be used anywhere else. Only the combination of the wallet address and the key gives you permission to send Bitcoin.
But the authentication process that happens among 100,000 computers in the network, they all have some way of verifying that key works, that key works for that wallet.
Exactly. So the essence of this kind of public key cryptography is it must be very difficult to complete one end of the problem, but extremely easy to verify it on the other end. So this is basically what it is. So you use the combination of these two things to create a third number, okay, which then can very easily, you can look at it, and a cryptographer can explain this better than I can. You can look at it and just with a trivial amount of work, verify that indeed this is the combination of these two numbers without knowing what the second number is. So, okay, let me hurry along. I'm going to tell you about T0. T0 is this financial technology subsidiary that Overstock's created. The name comes from the fact that in the stock market today, does anybody know how long it takes to settle a transaction? It takes 3 days. They call that T+3, T3. We call this T0 because we figured out how to affect trade settlement in 10 minutes. So it's T+0. You know, it's as close to real time as you're going to get for one. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about settlement. Let's talk about an investor and a hedge fund. And one has money and one has stock, and they want to engage in trade. But we all know it's not as simple as that. Instead, in the United States and in most of the world, the two halves of this process are divorced. So first, you have clearance, that's the money moving, and then settlement comes after 3 days later. Okay. And it's actually more complicated than that, because you're not doing business directly with the hedge fund. Instead, you have broker dealers that are operating in between, and the money and stock are moving within accounts and those broker dealers. But it's actually a little more complicated than that, because there's a centralized institution called the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. And those trades are actually going through the DTCC, okay? But it's even a little more complicated than that, because it's all the broker dealers in the world are all kind of hooked into the DTCC in a kind of a hub and spoke system. Does that diagram remind anybody of anything? Does it remind you that diagram of what a centralized network looks like? Okay, now, when you're thinking about Bitcoin and business opportunities in Bitcoin, one of the first things you need to do is ask yourself, how centralized is this industry that I want to disrupt with Bitcoin technology? Okay, the more centralized, the easier it is to disrupt, and I'll get to that more later. But so the way it actually is the money moves through the DTCC, but it's even a little more complicated than that because the stock is actually held in vaults, you could say, within the DTCC. So the trade happens there, and it's done through what's called netting. So like if I sell you 100 of something and you sell me 75, at the end of the day, you just get 25. Okay, that's called net settlement, and that's the way it's done currently. Okay, and I will also address some of the problems with that. One of the big problems with the DTCC is it's a black box. There's very few people really understand how the DTCC works, and that's in part due to the fact that it's owned by Goldman and JP and all the large bulge bracket banks. Okay, and this is a real revenue source for them. Okay, so what if we were to exchange stock instead of going through the DTCC? What if we were to do it on a ledger, on a distributed ledger? How would that look? Well, again, here we have the investor and a hedge fund owner. Their money is in a tokenized form. Okay, each one of those coins represents dollars, and they each have, so each of their wallets could contain two values. One is currency, and the other one is assets. Okay, so their wallet contains currency and assets. So let's just say these blue coins are shares of Overstock.com, for example. The way we could affect that trade is just, it's as simple as debiting one, crediting the other, debiting one, crediting the other. And then using the network of computers out there to verify that this was a legitimate transaction, that you had the money to send and the other person had the stock to send you. And then your accounts are simply debited and credited in accordance with the trade that you just made. So you can imagine a situation with the national market system that we could potentially replace the DTCC with this same kind of technology that makes Bitcoin work. Okay, and it's no longer just a theory. Overstock.com in June of last year actually sold a corporate bond to a company called First New York Securities, and this is just how it went. Each account was debited and credited, so they bought $5 million in Overstock bonds. The whole transaction was affected, settled, cleared, and then 90 days later unwound entirely on the Bitcoin blockchain. Okay. And so this just shows you, and this is not really intuitive, but I just wanted to show you, these are the blockchain records of that transaction. So you see it was it shows address numbers and amounts, debit, credit, back and forth. So this is the affecting of the trade and the unwinding of the trade as it happened on the Bitcoin blockchain. So in December of 2015, the SEC, so Overstock.com filed what's called an S3, a shelf registration with the SEC last summer, basically saying that the company wanted to have a secondary stock offering and have the right to issue some of those shares purely on a cryptographically protected distributed ledger. The SEC initially clearly had no idea what we were talking about, and we caught them completely flat-footed. But through a series of meetings and questions and answers and back and forths and amendments, we were able to kind of educate them on what we intend to do. They had previously approved an amendment we made to an alternative trading system, which we acquired, which said that the charter of the ATS was going to be expanded to include trading of digital shares. So we have the venue on which to do it. Now Overstock has been given permission by the SEC to actually issue these shares. So we announced in December that had happened, and then we announced in March that we are in fact going to have this secondary offering in the not too distant future. It's a rights offering, so it'll be existing shareholders of Overstock.com will have the right to buy either just regular preferred and trade it on NASDAQ or whatever they want, or have these shares, buy these shares and have them issued purely digitally. So that's coming up. So that was deemed effective in December 2015, and Overstock.com is going to be the first one to do this. And then at that point, we will go out and we believe that that because of the faster settlement time and lower transaction costs, that investors will demand that other issuers do the same. So we're intending to disrupt not only centralized depositories like the DTCC, but also exchanges. Where has anybody ever read this book called After the Trade is Made? Have you guys ever seen this book before? It's the worst book that's ever been written on the earth. It's 500 pages long, and it describes the whole current stock settlement process. It's terrible, like, because nobody understands it all. Anyway, we are taking that and reducing it to, a couple pages, making it really, really simple. So we see the opportunity to disrupt not only the exchanges, but also the centralized clearinghouses. Okay, so that's what's coming. Go ahead.
Where's the ledger kept on who will own those digital shares of the stock? You're going to have to make dividend payments, at least that's preferred from what I heard.
Correct.
So you're going to have to track all that, and as of right now, usually what custody departments usually track shareholders or the brokerage firm does, but the custody departments usually.
So this brings up two interesting points. One is the fact that the Bitcoin blockchain operates at a transaction speed of about 7 trades per second. Now, if you want to have a liquid, efficient market, 7 trades per second isn't going to do it. Visa processes 50,000 trades per second. So we've created our own version of the Bitcoin software that we're running on our own network. That's where they will. So and it basically it accommodates about 100,000 trades per second. So that's where they will exist. We've entered into an agreement with a company called ComputerShare, and they handle all the proxies and the dividends and all that. I mean, they track stock as it moves from beneficial to beneficial. So very good question.
Will your system offer complete anonymity like Bitcoin?
Yes, it will. So to the outsider looking at the ledger, all you'll see are addresses and assets and currency being sent from address to address. You can tell anybody that that's your address, I guess, if you want to, but otherwise, no. It'll be completely anonymous. You're right. So
in the regulatory world, there's an old axiom that you follow the money, and that's where you'll figure out where the crime occurred, right? If there's complete anonymity, how will the regulators look at this? Eventually, they're going to say this is right for trading on insider information, front running, money laundering. The list goes on and on.
So I should point out the way we've designed this is we're interfacing with every existing broker. So you would just go on to Scott. So Scott, if you have your Scott Trade or Ameritrade or whatever account, they've already done the know your customer and the anti-money laundering stuff. They know who you are. That order gets sent to us, and we know who you are. But as far as what the whole world sees in the form of the ledger, the whole world doesn't know who's behind each address. But that's all done.
You still need a traditional broker. You can.
Exactly. Yeah. Because the whole process of know your customer and that stuff's really complicated. So we figured we would use the existing brokerage's resources to affect that. Okay. So basically we're going to be the first, and so we will create a bunch of these digital shares, which will then be traded and.
So does so let's say that this is effective and you decide that it becomes a business for multiple, issuers. Does each issuer basically get its own unique version of blockchain technology then to be able to track that type of ledger? Because as I understand it, the key, what's sort of intrinsic to the ledger is that there's one kind of underlying asset. So if you kind of imagine this applying to 1,000 different stocks, you need sort of 1,000 different ledgers. Is that accurate?
It's a single ledger. Well, okay, that's actually a really good question. Probably for reasons you don't even know. That's a really good question because it's just interesting because that's one of the big. We've built this to be what's called ledger agnostic. So we will have a ledger that will run and will be like the canonical source of truth, recognizing that there could be other ledgers doing the same things out there, but that we will be able to interface with them too, and then take their data and add it to ours. So it will be kind of the whole view of the entire market of digital traded stocks. So, but that's a very good question. But no, so you won't need a separate ledger for every issue, for every issuer. One thing to note though is these shares are not fungible. So it's not like you can buy on the T0 platform and then sell on NASDAQ, or take it from NASDAQ and sell on T0. These have to be issued separately. It's a kind of a separate secondary stock offering or initial public offering. I want to take a minute. How are we on time? Okay. I want to take a minute and tell you, kind of add some context to some things you are probably aware of. If you watch the news at all, you've probably heard about some kind of controversial things in the Bitcoin world. I want to give you some context here. As I mentioned, the first group that gained that really latched onto Bitcoin were libertarians and anarchists, and these people who simply liked the idea of a currency that was not beholden to any government. That was completely stateless, that was deflationary, and then over time, as Bitcoin gained traction generally, you had kind of Wall Street showed up, and speculators showed up, and so you've had these two really distinct groups in the Bitcoin community, which have made it very interesting, and so that's produced kind of an interesting kind of a spectrum of attitudes I want to show you about. So as far as the man is concerned, you have two groups. You have the establishment, and then you have the anti-establishment people. The anti-establishment people want Bitcoin to be nothing but a decentralized currency that has as little government interference as possible. The establishment people see not only the value of the currency, but also the value of using the Bitcoin technology to do other things, to affect the trading of different kind of digital assets. So everybody that's in the Bitcoin world falls somewhere on that spectrum. This also is reflected in the kind of something I just referenced, that's Bitcoin's purpose. You have the establishment that want to see every block, right now a block that's added to the blockchain is 1 megabyte in size, again, which gives you about 7 transactions per second. There are people that want to make that larger, want to make it 2 megabytes in size, for example, so we get up to 14 transactions per second. That's the establishment. They want larger block size. The anarchists and the libertarians want small block size. The reason is the anarchists and libertarians worry that if block sizes increase, then the amount of effort it takes on behalf of the miners to process and verify those blocks will also increase, which will squeeze smaller people out of the process, and it will make it so the number of miners out there gets smaller and smaller and smaller, which they view as a form of centralization. They don't want that. So you may hear big like squabbling over Bitcoin block size, and this is almost caused a civil war in the community. And the reason is the establishment people want large block sizes, so this can become a platform upon which interesting kinds of trade can take place. And the individuals want the block size to remain small so that it remains the currency of the people. And third, on the attitude spectrum is the issue of regulation. You have some people like us at T0 that realize the only way to make this work is to cooperate with regulators, get their sign off on these things. And there are those in the community that say we're selling out, that we shouldn't be working with regulators at all, that we should be completely rogue and stateless. So everybody falls somewhere on that spectrum as well. And it's our attitude that if this technology is really to become mature and useful in the long run, that we have to operate within existing regulatory frameworks. So that's kind of what we've done. So yeah, so trustworthy, trustless. Okay, that's all I got. Go ahead.
Going back to the miners, and the point that you made about centralization, as I understand it, if you can get the solution to the problem fastest, you collect the 25, right? Mm-hmm. So why doesn't, and I'll just use the easy target, why doesn't Goldman just set up a bunch of supercomputers and mine everything so nobody can beat them to the punch and they collect everything?
And that's essentially what's happened now. Of those 100,000 computers, they've actually created what are called mining pools. There are only 4 mining pools. So you have all these computers, like 25% of them are in one pool, 25 another. All those computers are working together to form, a huge bank of supercomputers to try to be the first, and then those 25 Bitcoin are then distributed among all those people, so it's not just one. So Goldman would have a difficult time building a data center big enough to compete with the existing mining pools. But this is actually big business. It's interesting that the big issue is electricity. So Iceland has become a real center for Bitcoin mining activity because it's cold there, so it's easy to cool these things off, and electricity is so cheap because of geothermal. So you have all these big huge Bitcoin mining operations that are springing up in Iceland. But Goldman would probably have a difficult time competing with all that.
So could an average Joe like me sign up for a pool and say, I want in, I want to be part of it?
Mm-hmm. You could. You'd have to have a pretty high-end computer at this point. But in the old days, it was easy. Now you have to have a really high-end computer, otherwise you really don't have a chance. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. This was fascinating.
Thank you very much.
And if you guys have other questions, come back and you can come up and talk.
You can always come ask any question. Meeting at your. Thanks a
Thank
lot
you.
for coming.